Hello, I'm Mischievous Marcinacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy 15, and all of those Amazing Spider-Man annuals, which I still say do not count.
And I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which I say definitely count towards a collection of Amazing Spider-Man. But for me, Amazing Fantasy, a different series, especially number 15, remains a fantasy. Well, welcome everybody to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Thanks for joining us for this review of the Amazing Spider Talk.
You left me speechless there, Dan. If you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review to help spread the word about our show. You can also check out our Substack, Dan, at amazingspider.substack.com, where you can get all nice goodies of different comic book extensions of the podcast, basically. I mean, it's just where it's at, man.
Awesome. Well, as to that podcast and the Substack, they both exist because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, exclusive artwork, and keep our podcast and Substack and everything else we do going, go to amazingspidertalk.com and consider joining our Patreon. There's a big button that says Patreon. I mean, it couldn't be simpler than that. amazingspidertalk.com, a single click, and boom, you're there. Speaking of simple, let's get into our discussion of the issue. I say simple because we are simple-minded folks. Today on the show, Mark and I are going to be discussing Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 38. This issue is written by Zeb Wells. The cover artwork is by Ed McGuinness and Marcio Menyz, and interior artwork is also by Ed McGuinness and Emilio Laiso, inks by Mark Farmer, Wade von Grawbadger, and Ed McGuinness, with colors by Marcio Menyz and Erick Arcinega, and of course, letters by VC's Joe Caramanga. This issue was first released on November 22nd, 2023, right before Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. So I had to kind of rush out and get it today before the recording. But here we are, Mark. So why don't you give us our rek-rap recap of all the things that happened in this issue?
We're giving thanks that you were able to get that comic, Dan. That's for sure, yeah. Right? Okay. Well, we open with a record scratch. Yep, that's Spider-Man, hand sticking out of the mouth of Madeline Pryor's Demon Collector. Another important note, said mouth and throat is currently tightening around him, and folks, I really don't want to think through all of this.
Hey, don't forget to do your Kegel exercises, everyone.
Oh, yeah, do the little Thigh Master stuff. Anyway, Spidey goes all the way down the chute and comes upon rek-rap in the midst of rehashing his storytime adventure to his rogues gallery. And boy, those guys are as sick of rek-rap as apparently everyone else is, right? Apparently, time moves differently down in the belly of the beast, and let's just hope MJ doesn't cuck Peter again for someone else. Am I right, Dan? Oh.
It's funny that you point out how often he's returning to this specific plot thread.
Yes. Anyway, so to show that there is this new passage of time, we cut back and forth between the repossessor getting ready to do some bodily harm to Randy Robertson and Spidey and rek-rap climbing up the digestive tract of the monster. Days pass in the monster while it's merely seconds in the 616, though reading the phrase "Cowachugga baby choo choo" may have taken years off of my life. Just as the repossessor is ready to strike Randy, Spidey and rek-rap pop their heads out of the monster's mouth. For them, it is 7 days later, and they had to stick their heads. Well, Spider-Man doesn't want to talk about it. Right on, Spidey. Spidey goes to rescue Randy as the repossessor is readying to strike again. Randy shouts, "Look out!" just for kicks, and to annoy Dan. And it is at that moment when Peter finally realizes what Dan has been screaming about for weeks now, that Repo is actually the debt collector guy Gus from earlier in the run. Great sleuthin', Dan. Now tell us more about who MJ and Paul's kids are. I kid. Apparently the guy has been torturing and murdering people in his attic this whole time. Waka waka. Maybe he should team up with the monster in the basement of the hospital from the Beyond era. They could be a supervillain team called Normal Guys Who Turn Out to Be Inexplicably Monsters of Spider-Man. that title's great. I love it. Anyway,
rolls right off the tongue. Yeah,
totally. Spider-Man defeats the Repossessor by web zipping the evil guy's face into his own mouth. And the sooner we get away from all of his climbing in and out of other people's mouths, the better, I say. That brings us to the obligatory Madeline Pryor mea culpa to rek-rap. Ultimately, Repo gets punished for his extracurricular activities, and rek-rap gets a parade! Yay!
Yay!
But the comic doesn't end there, true believers, because we've got a major Spider-Man event starting next week. Randy is at Gracie Mansion, chatting up Mayor Luke Cage, and he is stirring up the pot about that Wilson Fisk no more vigilante justice rule. That sends our viewpoint over to Hammerhead, who instructs his goons to set up Mr. Negative by planting one of the inner demon masks at a crime scene. The next day, Hammerhead makes a play at turning all of the gang bosses against each other, manipulating them one at a time, while keeping his own flat top out of trouble. Oh, that diabolical Hammerhead. Meanwhile, in Harlem, Janice Lincoln is with her comatose father when Randy walks into the hospital room. Janice is not happy about Randy's ongoing defense of the super cops, and that lends to a rather awkward exit by her. Finally, we are at Magia Central, where Silvermane and Count Nefaria are plotting when all of a sudden Silvermane loses control of his robotic body and starts attacking Nefaria. I hate when that happens, especially when you're 80 years old, right, Dan? Anyway, then he attacks himself and rips off his own head when we see a purple boot step into frame, and Silvermane gives a knowing "you" exclamation. And that leads us to our next mystery box, Dan. I can't wait to spend way too much time hearing you speculate about the owner of that boot. And that is our recap.
Mark, I will definitely get into my thoughts on the owner of that boot. But to start us off on our discussion, I want to know if you thought that with this final issue of the rek-rap adventure that we've been on, the story managed to justify itself as an enjoyable side adventure before said proper gang war kicks off next week. What did you think? Did it win you over?
I mean, sorta. I don't know. I mean, look, I get that. There's a lot of things in play with gang war coming up. I mean, they got to give sweet John Romita Jr. some time to, get the book together and stuff like that. I'm sure Zeb has been plotting things. We got all these tie-in issues. So, I understand why they needed to kind of have this interlude here. I mean, is this the story that's going to move the needle? No. Was it a total waste of time? Not totally. I mean, it was enjoyable in a very irreverent way, but and I do appreciate how they tied in the gang war kind of glimpses, although I feel like, in infamous Mark terms in this issue, and even acknowledged so, it was attached with a rivet gun at the end. I mean, literally, it was, I mean, guys, this is where it comes from. This is the rivet gun effect in full force. Literally tacked it on. Anyway, so I have very unemotional responses to the storyline. I mean, it was fine. I understood why they had to do it. Would I have chosen to do 3 issues of rek-rap and Madeline Pryor and this Repo Demon? Probably not. But was it bad? No, they were objectively fine comics.
This is the definition of filler.
Right.
And frankly, Ed McGuinness's work on the title is kind of like all of the issues you would remove if Amazing Spider-Man was a monthly comic.
Right.
Otherwise we'd have a pretty, and I think it would, honestly, it would be a better series having done that. Which isn't to say I didn't like these issues. I think they are also quite fun. They are a palate cleanser. They are a pause from the main action and really from the action prior. This story has almost nothing to do with the previous one that we got. It is Mark said, attached with a rivet gun within the pages of the story, the things that are connected together, and the story itself. In the longer run, these are the ones you skip, which which isn't to say like it's not a good time. Like I said, rek-rap, I think here won me back over, whereas last issue I felt like we were rehashing jokes. Yeah, I guess we are here too, but I found myself smiling and laughing just as much as I did in his introductory story and in the first issue of this minor story. And I kind of like the setting of here, this one a little bit more. You know, we are seeing new crazy things for Ed McGuinness to draw. And at least on that level, I was like visually engaged, and the stories are all brought to a close, and we can talk about how effective that is. But at the very least, like I was like, okay, like this may be, and I'll say, I think Ed and Zeb are the weakest creative pairing with Zeb on this run. But issues like this are ones where I can laugh and see something visually exciting, and I can see what the appeal of Ed McGuinness is ostensibly, even if I don't necessarily think his work fits in this title particularly well.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, if I was to offer any pushback, and look, I'm not going to pretend to know like the schedules and the pacing that these guys need to work at professionally here. So like, this is just sheer talking off the top of my head here. But like, could we have accomplished an interlude like this with something of kind of the quality and tone of what we got with Patrick Gleason and the Craven story rather than this? And that, you know, and like you even frankly have another kind of element baked into the fact that because Spider-Man is, you know, distracted with, you know, the sins of Norman Osborn, that, you know, that's allowing all of the gangs to kind of assemble and cause havoc, and then he gets out of it, and voila, there's a gang war. Again, I don't know why they needed another 3 issues on top of that. I'm sure there are some scheduling things going on. Like I said, John Romita Jr. is one of the best in the biz, and if they want him to do gang war, there's a reason why he needed to do it when he did it. So like, I'm not gonna totally dwell on that, but like, it's just like, I would also argue that we kind of got this palate cleanser with the Doc Ock story, and we talked about that at the time, and that was kind of the obligatory Ed McGuinness silly issue, you know, and at least with that, like, I don't know, I feel like Doc Ock kind of getting, you know, his octoids and learning to do stuff there. Like it's still moving certain pieces forward on the board here. This feels very self-contained. This being the rek-rap story, very self-contained. I mean, you know, we got more rek-rap, you know, after many threats that was going to happen. I mean, you know, we kind of, you know, revisited the world of Madeline Pryor again, although I don't know if anyone was necessarily asking for that. And you know, the Repossessor, I would think for all intents and purposes is kind of, you know, has come and gone as a Spider-Man villain. So like, I don't know what we're going to get beyond that with this story. So you know, like I'm not trying to overly criticize this, but like, you know, in retrospect, it's like, did we really need 3 issues of this? I you know, like, I enjoyed this more than the last issue. I don't know if I enjoyed it as much as the first issue. It just, because like, I just also at the same time felt like we were just kind of overdoing this whole thing here. So,
well, it is curious, you know, what, like, I mean, if the reason for 3 issues was because they had some kind of schedule they had to keep or whatever, like, let's not forget, next week we have Amazing Spider-Man Gang War First Strike #1, which is a not proper issue of Amazing Spider-Man. Now, I don't know the focus of that issue. Like, will it be just about the gangs, and maybe Peter's not even in it, and therefore they felt uncomfortable calling it Amazing Spider-Man? I don't know. I've not looked at any previews or you know, it hasn't come out yet, obviously. So you know, I don't know, but like, you could shave an issue off of this and call that one a proper issue of Amazing Spider-Man, given that it seems like it's something you're going to want to read to keep up with it, the gang war story, and we're going to cover it on the show like it's a proper issue of Amazing Spider-Man, which maybe is a mistake on our part, but it does seem
we'll find
more,
out.
it does seem more important than, say, Amazing Spider-Man Ends of the Earth one shot, which you teased over me for a long time, especially in the way that they're advertising this one. So I don't know. I don't think you could really like blame it on pacing entirely, given that some weeks we have 3 weeks between books, and now we have like literally 1 week, and
Yeah.
title. So, these things change and ebb and flow, and I don't know what's going on in the Spider office. What I'm really curious about, the more we get work with Ed McGuinness, I feel like I'm always reassessing the guy and his role. Like that in the Otto story, we're like, okay, Ed's winning me over. And here I still think his art is gorgeous, and the tone stuff, it's so locked to Ed. I do wonder if maybe they have a more kind of Marvel style working relationship, because even just reading this one, the pacing feels so different than the what I would call the more tightly paced stuff of Zeb's other issues. Like, say what you will about Zeb's run, and people like it, don't like it, or feel right down the middle about it. But I feel like all his non-Ed McGuinness stuff is really tightly plotted. And I just thought that this 3-issue series was a little all over the place and didn't really know what to do with its middle chapter in a way that I'm not used to from Zeb. And, a artist who's getting to draw big splashy images, who's maybe given dictation over the plotting, I think can result in books being like that. We've seen a lot of artist-driven titles, like, paced like this, or, where the ending is rushed or whatever. So that's just my curiosity, although I would imagine that would be listed on the credits page if Ed had a stronger hand in plotting. But I don't know. Does it, am I going in a direction that sounds familiar to you? Like, do you recognize that?
I would agree with that. I think, like, if you go back at some of the major arcs that McGuinness has worked on, Dark Web and the Doc Ock arc, I mean, all of them, I don't think holistically the it's not like Zeb is going from this tightly plotted book to being Bendis and
Right.
and like, but like at the same time, there are definitely, I feel like you can find sequences in certainly each arc and maybe in each individual issue where it's just like things, it just feels like a particular scene or beat is just being dragged out too long because McGuinness needs to McGuinness it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, he needs to get really wild with talking hamburgers and it's the digestive tract of the repo monster, and like, or Otto's octoids, and or the arms taking over Jonah. Like every scene, just like, and they're in a vacuum, they're very attractive looking pages. So you're almost like, oh, all right, that's kind of cool. Like, I don't mind it because it's attractive art to look at and it's fun. It's fun art to look at. But at the same time, like, yeah, it feels like, the rhythm and the chemistry that you see with Ramita and Gleason on those storylines, it's just not there with McGuinness, in terms of how the book kind of moves at a consistent tempo, from page to page. So I think you're spot on with that. I don't know if it's Marvel style versus some other style, but there's clearly just not a full link or connection or chemistry thing going on between Wells and McGuinness. Not like terrible, but like just enough to throw the pace off a little bit.
I just think the style of the jokes are different. Like the jokes in these books, and I'm not even talking about like the tone. I'm talking about like how a joke is delivered.
Yeah.
In these books, the jokes are often like Spider-Man observing something, like here's a crazy meat train, or we're having a tickle fight with these things in the esophagus of, or make sure you always climb the esophagus, or whatever it is. Like it's always an observational joke. Whereas like I think back to like Gleason, like a tighter, crafted, written issue, like the first of the Spidey's Last Hunt, where you have like the vermin image and then the fist and then the vermin face again with his teeth all punched out. That's like a setup punchline, quite literally in that case. Whereas I don't think there are many punchlines here. It's a lot of like what reads to me like a writer getting art pages and going, what funny things can I have them say? And it just feels very different to me. Which again, like I think rek-rap is still funny, but it just feels different to me than what we've gotten before. So last thing, you mentioned the second half of this is a rivet gun esque gang war inclusion, and we'll talk about more details there.
For sure.
I kind of liked this approach to like bringing in gang war into this book. I mean, it is like literally, here's the end of the rek-rap story. Now let's go to this. But I can see why there might have been an appeal to like do it this way, which is to say Spider-Man is not an active, member of that ongoing story. And it does kind of tell its own adjacent story. Like we start off with Hammerhead, working for Silvermane. And by the end of this issue, at the beginning of the rek-rap story, but by the end of this issue, we've seen Silvermane destroyed, Hammerhead ascendant, and manipulating everybody. And I think like it's actually worked as a solid little mini story to set up gang war. And it actually has really worked for me, at least in regards to exciting me about what's to come. How about you?
I mean, again, like I have not minded how gang war has been interjected. In fact, I think up until this issue specifically, I really liked how we had these check-ins. I thought, it was kind of, we used to talk about in past runs like the check-ins with Jonah or the check-ins with May, and when we needed to kind of move those plot lines along, and I feel like this was equivalent to that. I mean, yes, it's not Peter was not at the focal point, so we didn't want to like dwell too long on it. I mean, I was making the rivet gun comment in this case. I mean, the comic itself acknowledges like we're just changing tones now, guys. So, like because like frankly, I was kind of like as I was reading this issue, I didn't get my copy quite as late in the cycle as you did, but I got it the Friday after Thanksgiving. So I'm like, reading it kind of, post holiday food coma. And I'm getting to the conclusion of the rek-rap story, and I'm just like, hey, like gang war starting next week. Where's our check-in? And then it was like, oh, it's all afterwards. And it was just like, all right, I like I don't know, like I don't know if does it truly make a difference if those pages are in the middle of a story versus at the end of a story. And I also get like, they were trying to establish this kind of tension and pacing with, they're inside this demon, and meanwhile the demon is stalking Randy. So that, like, we have to we didn't want to break from that too much, although maybe that could have been an effective breakaway. But then but we needed to have Randy out of it because Randy was pivotal to the things moving. So either way, it just felt very perfunctory at the end versus I feel like in the previous issues, it was integrated more tightly into the overall story. Does that, I don't think, to your point, we needed to necessarily co-opt an entire issue of ASM to do it, but like, that's just really where the form kind of comes from here. It's not that I disliked the form throughout this whole last few issues. It was just this one I was kind of like, oh, all right, it's just there.
Well, I mean, to the staying power of the rek-rap story, Randy is the best, lens through which to view it, which is, hey, I was almost murdered in an attic by a serial killing monster.
Right.
And now I'm out picketing, superheroes. And I think Wells tries to like thread that needle a little bit by saying like, hey, have Randy say like, I was just saved by a superhero.
Right.
And so therefore, like, I'm seeing additional need for them. But it is truly absurd. Like, this is not the realm of Amazing Spider-Man where a character getting abducted in that way would be a ongoing plot and he would have to recover from it. Like, the rek-rap story is truly, like, its own separate thing. So speaking of which, you acknowledged, I thought was a really funny moment where there's the acknowledgement of a more somber tone for gang war. If only because like it acknowledged what we all felt reading the comic, and you don't get an award for pointing out that you're maybe not doing the best job of something. But it did make me chuckle. Okay, we're sending rek-rap off into the great beyond, the undying lands, of Limbo's limbo, or I guess he's just in limbo now. And at the end of the issue, you see his name on the billboard, rek-rap. Everybody's celebrating him, and there's a little Spidey face that's a period down there. And my read of that is, this is the end of rek-rap's story. Like, we put a period there because it's not an ellipsis. It's, we know we had our fun, and this will be all we ever see of rek-rap. So, putting a bow on rek-rap, what'd you think of his role in this issue? Did he make you laugh? Tell me.
Oh, of course he did. Yeah, I mean, he made me laugh. I enjoyed it. I remain skeptical that this is truly the end of rek-rap.
Okay, all right.
I reserve the whole judgment on that, just because I just don't think there's a joke that this particular spider office doesn't like to beat dead into the ground sometimes. I just
fair enough.
I mean, prove me wrong. But yeah, I mean, like, it's certainly, I shouldn't say it's not that it's a kind of humor that we're not used to seeing. I mean, it's, we were talking off air about this kind of being like Spider-Ham, and you can certainly make that case that it's very Spider-Hamish in terms of the humor. It's also like, it's kind of like when Spider-Man teams up with Deadpool, or like when Chip Zdarsky gets to go like really cuckoo crazy with Spider-Man. Like, we have seen variations of this kind of humor before in different contexts. I think the fact that the context here is, it's this crazy demonic but benevolent demon character saying these things, and like, I am a sucker personally for kind of like the fish out of water sense of humor. Like, so much of rek-rap's humor is his inability to understand what is actually happening. When Spider-Man yells at Randy like that, and he's like, oh, that's the it's the battle cry. You know what I mean? Or what was it, the battle cry, or what does he say? It's like
it's time for a Spider-Man like catchphrase.
Randy. Like, I mean, it's those kinds of jokes where it's just like showing a lack of understanding for what's actually happening. I'm a sucker for it. And like, Zeb and Ed, or whoever else is truly involved in the craft of those jokes, hits it out of the park every time with rek-rap when it comes to those kind of jokes. So like, but that is my specific taste in humor, which I know not everyone shares. I'm sure there's some people who are like, I am so tired of like rek-rap basically being an idiot and that being funny. And it's like, yeah, but it's not that he's an idiot. He just doesn't understand, and whatever. So
that you hit the nail on the head. It's all about him having like a medium level of understanding of Spider-Man. Like the giant flies to eat is a great example.
Right.
Like, of course Spider-Man would eat giant flies. He's a man-sized spider, except he's not. And the Randy got a genuine like laugh out loud reaction from me when reading the comic. Just the timing of it was like that it was a page later, right, where he comes in, made me laugh. So
I was gonna say, I also appreciated all of the meta jokes here. I mean, like, we've been joking since day one, like rek-rap is overstaying his welcome. I know there are plenty of people on the internet that are like, what the hell is Marvel doing with this? And this book is just filled with like everyone being like, stop telling your stories, or like the monsters are crying except they're out of tears because they're tired of hearing from him. I mean, like, we all just acknowledge that rek-rap is annoying. He's weird. He has a very base level understanding of things, and that gets him into trouble. And it's benevolent. It's fine. It's candy coated comics, man. I don't know what else to say.
No, that's it. And like you said, if this is not your thing, I imagine these issues were quite painful. And comedy is one of those things that's really hard. I mean, when I used to be a professional film critic, and had to write about comedies, I kind of dreaded it because I know I have a very offbeat sense of humor that doesn't match up with everyone all the time. And so like, or I don't have a mainstream sense of humor. So like they would send me to watch like a mainstream comedy. And it's like, what do I even say? Like these jokes just don't work for me, but they might for you. It's a hard thing to weigh in on. And for the most part, I've enjoyed rek-rap, but I am also eager to see this innocent child sail off into limbo, and just to be a very faint footprint on the pages of somewhere. There's going to be a listicle of all-time great Spider-Man villains who have had less comic appearances than rek-rap. And, maybe like 10 years ago, Mark, you would have written that. But
there you go.
Anyway, so Mark, in regards to said list, I bet that list could be accumulated somewhere. Where might our listeners go to read some such thing?
Well, I mean, of the many places, hundreds of listeners like you hang out in our community of Spider-Man fans on our Slack. The amazing Spider Slack community is absolutely free to join, and you can jump into active conversation with awesome people about collecting, conventions, movies, new comics, old comics, listicles, and more. Dan, what's been going on in the Slack this week?
Well, Mark, I'm kind of reluctant to bring this up, but it was an interesting thing, and I'll mention it here, and maybe we'll talk about it more in the future. But in regards to, like, you and I covered the Nick Spencer run, the Slack has been talking a lot about how Dan Slott appeared in CBR forums, which, man, I would really encourage the guy to stop doing. But he releases information as like a claritative, I think, which I personally think raised more questions. But
Right.
He let it slip that Nick Spencer had in fact been seeking to undo One More Day, but that the editors never approved it. Like from the get-go, they never approved it, period, which is something that personally I'm a bit dubious of, for my own reasons and reasons that I think are apparent in the book itself.
Right.
But it's made for an interesting conversation in the Slack about, one, if that is true,
Right.
why would they play so loosely with this?
Right.
And two, if it is true, it just brings up so many questions rather than clarifying anything. I personally think, and it's nice to read, people weighing in on this who understand a full history of the character and don't have a particular agenda that they're trying to drive home, and we're just trying to understand what actually happened during the run that you and I covered so extensively. Did you see this, Mark?
I did not. Well, you know me, I'm not on the Slack. I'm on the Slack like once or twice a month. So I must have missed this conversation, but I also missed this whole conversation with Dan Slott. I mean, did this make its way onto Twitter or something?
Of course it did, Mark.
Of course it did. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm very rarely on that app now too. So I'm missing everything. But I mean, I share in my dubiousness, not what Nick Spencer's intent might have been, but that, I don't know, that they would let someone write a book for 3 years and start putting the things into place, even though they never approved it in the first place. That just, that's just challenging. But, and then again, it's a wacky time in the Spider Office sometimes. So who knows? I mean,
just another chapter in potentially unveiling whatever happened during that run, which seems to be slowly, finally starting to leak out, more and more these days. So anyway, if you want to join in on that conversation, and respectfully, uncover Spider-Man history, there's no better place to do it than the Slack. There's a link in the description of every episode of our show that you can click on. It'll take you right into the Slack. You can create a username for yourself. Come say hi. Or maybe you joined before and you become a lapsed user or never said hi. Come in. We love having new people in the Slack.
I love it, Dan. All right. Well, let's get back to our issue conversation here. Why don't we? So now we've had 3 issues, and it sounds like it's just going to be those three. I mean, putting aside what I said about rek-rap earlier, I do think this is probably a one and done character. The Repossessor, we kind of tied a bow on that whole saga, and it's like, all right, so the debt collector actually turned out to be a really crazy serial killer, and it's like, oh, I mean, could have just been a debt collector too. I don't know. What are we supposed to take from this? I don't know.
I mean, is the next thing we're going to find out that like landlord Miss Muggins was actually like mugging people and, with your own superpowers, or like Lonesome Pincus is like a herald of Galactus, like I joke, but like those were, as much as we make fun of like Lonesome Pincus in the past, but like those characters were like real New York people that made Peter Parker's life rich. And the fact that they never crossed over into the superheroics, other than maybe potentially being victims of said superheroics, is what made this book special. Right. And, it's not to say that Zeb, hasn't done, other great stuff with non-superpowered folks, but like, as this book leans more in that direction, I do think it loses some of its identity. Like, I'm okay with Randy dating a supervillain, but it's not something I feel like this title would have done 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And like the same is true with a character like the debt collector. Like, comics have to find a way to introduce villains into these characters' lives. But I feel like in Peter's life, it's not often that like some innocuous character just suddenly ends up being, a like serial killer supervillain.
Right.
Maybe I'm just singling this out because for lack of other normal people in this run, I guess Paul was fairly normal. But even that's an example, right? He used to be involved with a genocidal maniac from another dimension,
and he's from another universe and has no time will tell on that too, Dan. So
what do you think is the rule around this? Like, does the debt collector stand out as like an aberration, or like they have to get villains from somewhere? Like Dr. Octopus was a doctor at some point, like how do you feel about all this?
I mean, talking specifically about this character, I mean, like, I know when he got turned by Madeline Pryor in Dark Web, they insinuated that there was something very dark and sinister about him. But like the fact
which I'll comment on that. Madeline Pryor here says, "Oh, only rek-rap is the one who could have like solved this and found this out about him." And it's like, wait a minute, Madeline Pryor, you were the one who mentioned it before. Sorry,
right.
That doesn't make sense. But
right. Well, I would also add that like, I know Madeline Pryor isn't exactly a paradigm of virtue here.
Well, right. So there's that. Yeah.
But it's also just like, wow, like you set this guy, this is your deck. This is your demon collector, this like sociopath. I mean, you're trying to like make right by the city with this deal you struck with Mayor with Mayor Adams in New York. So no, I am putting that aside from Dark Web. Like what strikes me as being kind of absurd here and abnormal is the fact that, I mean, like in the context of how this character was introduced in Amazing Spider-Man, I mean, we had this, this storyline running about, Peter being so outrageously down on his luck that, we had, we got into the point where like we had a debt collector coming after him, which was kind of like that in and of itself was kind of ratcheting up the drama in Peter's life. I mean, typically it's always like, oh, Peter, because of his Spider-Man antics, can't pay the rent, or, like he blew up his apartment again, or whatever, whatever the case may be. But like, oh, but this time, like, now he's really in hot water. He's got like, someone coming after him, but like in a legal sense, like and like, I feel like that's fine in of itself. Like, why did you have to kind of like sometimes, like, I know they say, oh, good storytelling, you keep turning the screw. Like, no, like stop turning, like they should have just stopped turning the screw there. I didn't need that, and there for all that we needed, there just could have been some other demon that Madeline sent out that turned out to be a really bad demon that wanted to
Yeah.
kill Peter or kill Randy for some reason, and that would be fine. So like, I don't understand, like this is trying to, put your chocolate and peanut butter together, and it's not working in my opinion. Like I found that, like, yes, we, all kidding aside, we knew this was what it was from the get-go, or you pointed it out, and I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I remember now. But all the same, it was just like, very unnecessary. And no, I don't think this is how you create new villains. It's like, no, this is just silly, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, like, I think the problem with this one is that this character showed up in Peter's life, like before he was like in a different context. He was just a normal guy that Peter bumped into. And normally when Peter gets a new villain, it's someone who has their like an agenda, like they have a separate agenda that has nothing to do with Peter, right? This guy was coming after Peter, right? And now we learned to ostensibly murder him in his attic,
Right.
And like, that's not really typical. I mean, how often do you run into a serial killer in New York City? Like, it seems like pretty far-fetched. You're about to tell me otherwise, but
no, I try not to think about it, Dan. I mean, as someone who goes into the city several days a week. So
yeah. But if a member of Peter's cast that's a normal person does get superpowers, it's usually through like one or two different ways. It's because of a choice that Peter makes that backfires and turns them into something else that maybe accentuates their already kind of crap persona. But they're not like just like incidental, like, oh, I happen to bump into like this guy's coming after Peter and he's a supervillain already.
Right.
That is really unusual, and removes Peter from an everyman position, which is like, not the everyman doesn't deal with supervillains or serial killers coming after them. And that's what I think makes this character stand out. And then you're right, the reveal is pointless, and it adds nothing to the story. And the way it adds nothing to the story is when Peter realizes it and then just beats him up anyway. Like, it doesn't change how Peter acts. Like,
No.
if he found out this guy was the debt collector and then was like, I don't like debt collectors, I mean, that would be the barest,
Right.
minimum. But it doesn't even go that far. It's just like, oh, okay, we solved that mystery. That, I guess.
We Scooby-Dooed it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he's disappeared by the end and made vague reference to. And it's like, you're right. It could have been any random demon. Like, it's a mystery to have a mystery. And there you go. We solved it.
All right. You did it, Dan. All right. So we go from one mystery to another mystery. This one, of course, related to the somber tone of the comic. The gang war part. So where do you want to start with this gang war part? Because sausage making note. I know people like when I talk about the sausage making, but when in my original recap, when we got to the gang war section, Dan actually had to make some edits because I kind of misread what was going on, which is a note to say that, like, I actually found parts of this section to be a little confusing to read. I mean, I got the gist of it, which is like Hammerhead is just pulling all these strings all over the place right now. But like, I do worry a little bit in retrospect that if they're trying to Zeb is trying to tell a very intricate, this one's doing this to this one and this one and this one and this one, that this is how it's coming across, because it's I felt that some of the nuances was getting really muddied, especially in kind of the way this was crafted, which is like slamming all this together at the end of this comic. I don't know. What did you think?
Yeah, I largely agree, but I actually don't know that it's necessarily Zeb Wells that is confusing me.
Okay.
I think the page in particular where Hammerhead is going to all the different like gang leaders is really interestingly constructed from a writing point of view, which is like, you don't ever know who he's talking to, and all the conversations kind of blur together and kind of remove Hammerhead from this scenario, which is like what he wants to do. The problem is really, and I really love Marcio Menyz's colors, and so looking at this, my problem is really with the colors. And I think this is Erick Arcinega who did the colors in this backup, and that all of those images have the same background coloring, suggests they're all in the same place, which makes it confusing. It feels like he's talking to everybody, and I feel like it's something Marcio Menyz wouldn't do in terms of like the storytelling element of that. And I don't know that like Zeb would spell that out in a script to say like, please make sure that these all read differently. And that's what confused me. I reread it actually and was like, oh, I see what's going on here. They're not at a meeting like we've seen before. It's all different locations. So like, I think that's really on the art team and editorial, maybe should have caught it like as a sort of like, hey, how is a new reader going to approach this? How do we give them the most tools to be successful?
Yeah. The least you could have done was change Hammerhead's sweatshirt color, right? No. Anyway.
But I got to say, in terms of clarity with the writing, I really like how, like, my biggest concern was as they add more characters to this gang war, I'm not going to be able to keep up with all the intricacies of it. And I really felt like by the end of this story, it had like set up, okay, Silvermane and Count Nefaria. And you and I were like, oh my God, they're bringing in Count Nefaria and all these people. And by the end of this, it's like, no, we're going to collapse all of that. Right. Which is like everybody that Hammerhead is dealing with, they're all just pawns to whatever he's doing, like, I think by this point, it seems fairly clear that Hammerhead has another agenda going on. And so like the big players here seem to really just be Hammerhead and whoever this mysterious figure is at the end, which frankly could be the same team, like we don't necessarily know. And so I found this kind of refreshing in that I'm like, okay, going into the gang war, I really kind of already know who the major players are I should really be paying attention to. And I found that refreshing. I don't know if you feel the same way, but
yeah, I see what you're saying in terms of the clarity here and like, how these characters are kind of weaving in and weaving out. I definitely give credence to your viewpoint. Like, the issue I was having was more with the artwork rather than the actual writing. I guess I'm still just a little hesitant with how all of these character, because like I'm going to be totally real with you, Dan. I mean, like some of these characters like Nefaria and even like the Man of Mask stuff and stuff like that, like I'm just like I don't really follow these characters intently because I don't frankly think of them as Spider-Man characters. So like when we're bringing this stuff in, it's like, okay, I think I understand the intricacies of who's with who here, but like, it's a lot different when it's Hammerhead, Tombstone, and Mr. Negative versus all these other characters, which then brings us to like the big mystery villain at the end. And like I had this one moment, to be totally honest, and this is about as far speculative as I'm going to get here. You can get much more because that's what you do, Dan. But we were talking about, I don't know if it was last issue or the issue before, like, oh man, wouldn't it just be great if Marvel finally remembered like Shocker's agreement with Silvermane.
Oh man, I would love that.
And like I was ready to believe when this all started happening, and then I was like, but it was like it's a purple boot, and like it's not like Shocker has telekinetic powers, so like it's probably not. But like, what do you think here, though, Dan?
Well, I mean, to your point about who's who. Marvel.com actually has a great article up right now that breaks down all the various gangs that exist before heading into gang war. So if you are confused, I would recommend you check that out. And again, my feeling is that like this is going to be largely cleaned up. You're already seeing like Hammerhead putting down Mr. Negative's masks and killing vampires. It's like, I think they're going to wipe the floor with some of these lower level gangs pretty quickly. and really had it be down to some Spider-Man villains if I had to guess. So I like that. And in regards to the mystery character, let's just like talk about the purple boots for a second, because like which characters in Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery famously have purple boots? You know, Green Goblin comes to mind. Do I think they would pin the whole gang war on Green Goblin? I mean, frankly, Marvel will pin any storyline they can on the Green Goblin. If for people who have been around in the 90s, you know, that was the surprise last second twist villain of everything. And it does make sense here if Norman is starting to get some of his Green Goblin personality back, that, you know, the Green Goblin's original, you know, motive was mucking in gang wars. And so the boots, and then the line at the end where it says like getting into a gang war sounds like fun, does sound like something Green Goblin would say. You know,
sure.
Like the chaos of it, the fun of it. Like, so, I mean, just on a like very basic level, that is the first thing that really comes to mind for me. So what do you think about that?
I mean, still doesn't explain like how the attack on Silvermane went about, because again, like
that's prior to him getting the sins back.
Yeah, I mean, could it be Mysterio? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Like, not that Mysterio necessarily is telekinetic, but he can make things look like it's happening. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it's you know, but like I know Mysterio doesn't necessarily have purple boots, but he's got a purple motif. Maybe he got new boots. You know what I mean? Like, although you would think you would see a fishbowl silhouette.
I didn't necessarily read this as telekinesis more than it was like a his suit malfunctioning, you know?
Right.
So like we saw him get the new armor, like the new body just a couple issues ago. Like the question is who made that thing, you know? And like we've been seeing Norman tinkering away at things at Osborn. So like you could do that, you know. Who is good at like rebuilding robots? Like, I don't know. I don't think this whole thing would be pinned on Robot Master. That would be from out of left field, especially since he's dead, you know, comic book dead, you know.
Or are we gonna get Norman doing this? But I guess that's part of it too. Is like I don't know. Like, would it make more sense to treat Norman as to treat Goblin as a mystery rogue here, or is the storyline in knowing it's Goblin and like, oh, like how turned is Norman, and then, you know, playing with that, you know, subversing that. I don't know. Like I guess like that's part of it too. Is just like I don't see what the storyline value is in if you know, in bringing in a new character on the field and shrouded in mystery, and then just being like, oh wait, no, it's Green. I don't know. I don't know. It seems too obvious to me. But then again, you know, sometimes the obvious answer is, you know, they try to make it unobvious by, you know, having it be Mason Banks as Norman Osborn. So I don't know.
I mean, we, you know, in regards to the like who hired Shotgun, you know, we don't know that this character is that character, right? Like Shotgun implied that there's a new player on the field, right? But that could have been a separate thing, right? Like I still think Hammerhead has his own thing going here. You know, like both Nefaria and Silvermane start their discussion as describing him as a loyal pawn, which is just about the greatest way to signal that someone is not going to be a loyal pawn. You know? And we get the reappearance of like Hammerhead's girlfriend, so to speak, here, that kind of like quiet figure that was introduced at the wedding that I pointed out there, whether that's like Madame Mask or Felicia in disguise or some new villain. It does seem like they are making a on-page appearances point to show us this character, you know, engage with Hammerhead. So like maybe Hammerhead is not, I mean, we know he's not the smartest guy on the planet, and maybe couldn't pull off a coup like this, given that he woke up from a head injury and decided to reshape his personality off of a poster he saw. Maybe that is the person whispering in his ear and helping him pull off what I think he's pulling off, which I think is made very clear here. He is manipulating everybody to keep himself out of the fray. Like they all think he's their ally while he's turning them against each other. Have we seen Hammerhead have the intellect to pull that off before? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And this is clearly a male figure at the end of the book, and the girl that's with Hammerhead is obviously a woman. So they want you to think that's not the same person. It could be Chameleon. I mean, we don't know, like Chameleon will be kind of a fun thing to give him a one-up after he got that absolutely terrible storyline from Nick Spencer's run, which is better left, like, less said about. It's Teresa Parker. No, I'm just kidding.
Man.
I mean, like, my money right now would be on, like, this is a separate character entering the fray, and it's Green Goblin, but Hammerhead and this woman are also pulling games, faking Madame Mask's death, etc. Which, again, not confirmed, but I am heavily suspicious of. So,
all right. I'm going to cut you off there. No more.
Please, that's all I have. Honestly, I don't know. And I'm not really all that excited about speculating because I'm kind of excited to just let this play out. I think it's kind of been fun so far. So, yeah,
for sure. All right. Well, we'll get more in a week, Dan. So, what's your grade on this issue?
I'm giving this one a C+.
I'm right there with you, sir. C+ from me.
Yeah, a very slightly above average comic.
Yep. Well, on that note, Dan, it's that time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this episode of the Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, this podcast exists because of listener support on our Patreon. For only $3.99 a month, less than the cost of a new comic. I didn't think I would be saying that this soon, but there it is. You can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including these reviews the same week the comics release. So if you're listening to this and you're like, man, this would have been great to listen to when I first read the comic, Patreon, that's the answer. Plus, we give out exclusive artwork and a ton of other bonuses. So a thank you to everyone who already supports us and the work that we do. Plus, we wanted to extend a special thanks to our newest Patreon contributor, Austin Komprowski.
Awesome. Thank you, Austin. To download our earliest episodes, including interviews with legendary creators like J.M. DeMatteis, Tom DeFalco, Ron Friends, Mark Bagley, David Michelini, and many more, subscribe to our Amazing Spider Talk Back Issues podcast on Apple Podcasts.
Lastly, don't forget to subscribe to our Amazing Spider Talk Substack. Truly, Mark and I consider it the kind of B-side to these episodes. We're putting a lot of energy into this and really making it special. So if you haven't checked it out yet, I cannot encourage you enough to go check it out. Again, you can go to amazingspider.substack.com to subscribe. Mark, what things did we discuss on the Substack this week?
Well, we talked about the new Peter Miles book, Spectacular Spider-Man, as well as also the debut trailer for Madam Web, whatever that was, and also my tale of my lost copy of Amazing Spider-Man number 300 and how it found its way back to me 30 years later. Lots of great stuff in the Substack. You really shouldn't miss it, folks.
Awesome. So, Mark, until our podcast hosting provider turns out to have been a trap to lure us into the arms of a serial killing network of web gurus, what's our motto?
With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.